Hey there again, Social Studies 30-1, taking a look at our third source of the week. Of course, the theme has been the Cold War. I guess if we wanted to get specific, it would be the Marshall Plan. So a longer source today, tougher source today. So I'll give you a minute or so to examine the source and then listen to the explanation. Okay, a very damning quote, I guess, source regarding the Marshall Plan. Historically, and I want you to think about the sources we've already covered. Historically, the Marshall Plan has been sold to, for sure, the American psyche, but also, the psyche of the Western Hemisphere as a savior. The Marshall Plan saved you from communism. If you were Western European, you were lucky. The Americans offered the Marshall Plan. And again, you might talk a bit about the Marshall Plan in specifics. How much money? Well, $13 billion. Dollars. How many countries? Well, 17 countries applied and got Marshall Plan money. And you would talk about why it seemed necessary at that time. It was to prevent a communist revolution in Western Europe. There was already political crisis, there's economic crisis. You could argue Western Europe had a climate that was ripe for a communist revolution. But this guy's taking a different take on the Marshall Plan. This guy's critiquing, he's slamming the Marshall Plan. He's saying basically in the first stanza up here that, the Marshall Plan was sold in the name of rebuilding and providing security against aggression, trumped up threats to American security. That would, of course, be the threat of communism. Don't forget the communism was a dire threat back home in America. At least it was sold as a dire threat. Makes me think of McCarthyism and the McCarthy hearings where, through a modern day witch hunt, they ruined people's lives who were associated with communism. So I kind of get that flavor from the first stanza. It's not what it was originally sold as. Um, it really had nothing to do with rebuilding and providing security. Those were excuses made up by the American government to promote American foreign policy and American influence. To me, the meat and bones of the source is the middle paragraph, the middle stanza. And what really struck me was the part that I highlighted in blue. Don't forget how the Marshall Plan worked. America gave $13 billion dollars to the Western European nations. Yes, that's true. But where do you think they got the $13 billion dollars from? It came from American taxpayers. So the government took American taxpayers' money, um, exaggerated the threat of a looming communist takeover in Western Europe and even back home in America too under the McCarthy hearings. So they took American taxpayer money, embellished the threat of communism, gave that money to Western European countries, but the one caveat was that those Western European countries had to buy American products. They had to use the money that the American government took from its own taxpayers, and they had to give it back to America in the form of buying American oil, American aluminum, wood, textiles, machinery, and so on. So, like the guy says, the largest peacetime transfer of wealth from the taxpayers to corporations was because of the Marshall Plan. That could be true. That there were all kinds of invisible strings attached to that money. Sure, we'll give you the money, but you've got to buy American products with the money that we give you. And they did. They had to. They needed the money. They had to rebuild their infrastructure. So, in many ways, the American government robbed its own people. in that they took their tax money, gave it to Europe, and in turn, Europe got American corporations, made them even richer, gave them even more money than they had in the first place at the expense of the American taxpayer. Now, if this had been known at the time, I'm sure there would have been outrage, but this is what we call revisionist history, revising history based on new data, evidence, and so on. And so the guy goes on to say, the actual legacy of the Marshall Plan was, sure they robbed Americans, but they didn't just stop at that. This allowed America to, put troops on a permanent basis in Western Europe under the guise that they're protecting them from communism, which probably wasn't true. And it was the first time the government, passed policy to allow the business class to get even richer at the expense of the American taxpayer. And he concludes by saying that this never really went away in America. And you know what? That could be true because it makes me think of the movie The Big Short and the causes of The Big Short and how, in the end, and we didn't actually get to see the end of the movie because of the lockdown, but in the end, the American government bailed out the banks. They kept them afloat. They gave them billions of dollars to keep those businesses afloat, and it kind of reinforces, you know, the last line in that source. Government is connecting interest groups to run the world at taxpayer expense. There could be a lot of truth to that source. Um, a way different angle and version of the Marshall Plan than we've looked at so far. It doesn't look at the Marshall Plan as a savior. It looks at it more of a means of robbery and theft of the American taxpayers, based on government lies, embellishment of trumped up threats, and so on. Um, really too bad if it's true. In terms of connections, well, I'm thinking rule of law in that the government put itself above the rule of law when they embellished the threat. They took American taxpayer money to help American business and get wealthier. You could connect it to that. You could talk about economic freedom. Maybe there was too much economic freedom. The economy, if it had been more regulated, maybe that would not have happened. And for sure, self-interest. The government's putting its self-interest ahead of the American public. I mean, they did this to increase American influence worldwide, especially in Western Europe, at the expense of the American public. So you could connect it via that as well. In terms of links, I see someone who is challenging liberalism, someone who is critiquing liberalism. It's not what we thought it was. It's not what we were told it was. In many ways, liberalism is actually hurting people's basic rights and freedoms. They had no say in where their tax dollars went. You could certainly link it that way. Probably all I would do with the source. I think we're pretty good that way. While we're at it, let's connect them. So source one talked about, it wasn't the actual aid of the Marshall Plan itself that saved Western Europe. If it saved Western Europe at all, it's that, they had to embrace free trade, decontrol prices, eliminate trade restrictions, and so on, resist nationalization. So they had to embrace and promote capitalism. That's what made the Marshall Plan work, according to source one. Source two talked about the Marshall Plan as an out and out savior, saving them from the evilness of communism and the Soviet Union. And then we just did source three, a very harsh critique of the Marshall Plan. So again, and we won't do this many more times, makes me kind of sad. What we're looking for is a theme. So you could say all three sources are linked via the theme of the Marshall Plan. Source one is questioning the Marshall Plan. Source two is advocating, championing the Marshall Plan. Source three is the harshest critic of the Marshall Plan. You could talk about that. Um, I'm not sure I see a cause and effect. What I might do for a second relationship, this would be the commonly accepted version of the Marshall Plan. It's a savior. This would be a moderate questioning of the Marshall Plan. And this is an out and out, defamation of the Marshall Plan. That could be one road that you go down to. One last one might be this is, the traditional version view of the Marshall Plan, and the other two are examples of revisionist history of the Marshall Plan. Source one's questioning it, and source three is really questioning it. That's probably as far as you need to go. So good job if you've been following along with the sources. I hope you have. It's going to make you a better reader. It's going to make you more literate. and you'll be a critic of news and the media and policy and politics, rather than just someone who follows along and listens to it. Thanks for listening.